what's going on in Europe, I know that you're not in Europe right now, but when you see what is happening, it seems that the whole NATO countries are gathering or supporting the United States. We had Starmer before. He said, we're not going to join. He said, we're going to join because our bases were influenced or whatever he has in his mind. But he's joining, not, he said, not unoffensive, but defensive, but defending, the bases, the United States, Israel, basically, or Cyprus, because we know that most of these fighter jets are in Cyprus as we talk. And how do you see the current situation with the war?
Well, I mean, we'll start and address the point you just made. It's the opening statements when this war broke out. Specifically, we're looking at the E3 countries, which are the UK, Germany, and France. And rather than condemn the U.S. or Israel for initiating an unprovoked war of choice, an undeclared war of aggression against Iran during high-level negotiations, we can't forget there were high-level negotiations going on via Oman between the Americans and the Iranians. And that was at least sold to the world that this was a potential off-ramp to avoid a war. And as we now know, that those negotiations were not done in good faith by the United States. They were used to buy time to plan a sneak attack against the Iranians for the second time. This happened before in June, just 8 months ago. So that's the first thing. So there are no condemnation. Instead, the almost not identical but near identical statements by all the European countries, which is that we defend our allies, the United States, and we support our allies, the U.S. They didn't go so far as to say they supported Israel in this endeavor, because obviously Israel technically struck first on this. But there was that, and then it followed with the follow-up statements. Specifically, we could say Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, saying the Iranian regime is absolutely abhorrent. That was his opening gambit. Okay, so this is an Iranian government that was negotiating to avoid war, and is now being immediately labeled by the British leader as abhorrent. Okay. And then he's hearkening back to, they've massacred their protesters in January, and that whole canard is then used to justify the sort of standoff position, at least at the beginning of these European countries. Okay, and we know I can say without any shadow of a doubt that accusations that the Iranian regime was massacring protesters in 10 or 20,000 or 30,000 is 100% categorically fabricated, false. And that's both from what I saw on the ground when I reported and visited Tehran 3 weeks ago, and also just based on the easily debunkable claims by U.S.-based Iranian human rights NGOs. I just want to make that very clear. There's no provenance for any of the accusations or claims that have just been injected into the U.S. media and repeated by politicians in the West that the Iranian regime has massacred democratic protesters and so forth. Not true. In fact, the opposite is true. We have evidence that U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence specifically were involved in agent provocateurs and seeding violent elements into the protests in Tehran which was designed to get some kind of chaotic situation, and then the U.S. openly, Donald Trump himself, touting for the people to rise up and take over their institutions. I mean, that's just total incitement. That's on record, by the way. So, I mean, it's very clear. We saw this playbook in Maidan in 2014. We saw it in Syria in 2011 and 2012 and many times after that. And we saw it in Libya again and again and throughout Eastern Europe. Okay, so this type of color revolution formula by sowing chaos. So I have to put that out there, Nima, because this is so important. Why is this important? There's zero evidence that Iran was developing a nuclear weapon. There's nothing. They have nothing. Totally threadbare. They didn't have anything during the whole JCPOA negotiations period. The JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which was instituted under the Obama administration in 2015 and 16, that was just double insurance policy that Iran wouldn't develop a nuclear weapon. At that point, there was no evidence that they were even developing one, but that was a double insurance policy. So Trump wanted to revisit that and put this facade that he's wanting to get a nuclear deal, when in fact there was no interest at all from the U.S. to do that, because everyone in the U.S. intelligence community knows Iran wasn't ever developing a nuclear weapon. It's a political talking point. The U.S.'s own CIA and the Office of Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, said so, and in two different points in March and also later in June, was thrown under the bus by Donald Trump publicly, with no protest from Tulsi Gabbard or anybody in her department. So there's nothing on the nuclear front, and then they pivoted to, well, no, this war is about Iran's missiles. Well, that's a very weak argument, because you're basically calling for the demilitarization of a country that has already been attacked by U.S. and Israel unprovoked. So they have a right to self-defense under international law, and everybody knows that. So then now we're left with the democratic protesters that were savagely massacred by the regime. This is the most important point, because even if you're a MAGA anti-war, a neutral non-interventionist, okay, or an isolationist or whatever, you still will back this war, because, and they use the exact same psychology in the information war to prepare for the Iraq war, for the war in Libya, for the war in Syria, is that, well, we're against the war, but it's better that Saddam is gone. Because he was an evil dictator, and we're against this war in Iran, but at least the mullahs have been killed, or the supreme leader is dead, and it's a safer place. The world's a better place because this evil avatar has been eliminated. That has been the stock and trade propaganda program for the West to manufacture consent on the background of consent. So people, moderates, can oppose the war, but then the chattering classes in the West will look at each other and say, well, it's still better that, he's gone, because there's an evil dictator there. Same with Yugoslavia, same with Libya, and the list goes on and on. So I'm harping on this point, Nima, and I want to make this point and underline it double, because this is the back psychological justification for manufacturing consent for this war, because the nuclear argument just fell flat on its face. That's why Trump kept pivoting away from it, and he even went back to it desperately again for the second time in the last year. So it's fraudulent on every conceivable level, and that's what the Europeans. Back to your original point, Nima. That's what the Europeans are using as their moral virtue signaling, their moral justification for standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States and Israel in this moral war to rid the region of this terrorist menace that is called the Iranian regime. That's kind of the narrative that they're operating on here. And people need to understand that's the spectrum that you're dealing with on this. There is no, in terms of international law, in terms of the laws of war, in terms of international conventions, all agreed upon frameworks for European countries and the U.S. and everybody in the UN international system. There's no basis at all, no justification at all for this unilateral attack on Iran by the United States and Israel. Nothing. There is nothing. All they have is the exact same formula that they used in Iraq and in Libya and in Syria and in Yugoslavia and many, many other places, and Ukraine for that matter, with the coup in Maidan. So I know this might sound redundant to some people, but you really have to understand that's how important that propaganda was in January. That's why they spent hundreds of millions of dollars paying influencers to put out videos saying, Donald Trump, you need to come and rescue these Democratic protesters. They're being killed in the street. They paid thousands of dollars per X user and YouTubers and people on social media to put this scripted lie out, because that was laying the groundwork for what we are seeing right now. And right now, we're not seeing any protests from the West. The United States are using gravity bombs to bomb densely populated neighborhoods in a city of 10 million in Tehran. There's absolutely no pushback whatsoever, and this is just an extension of the complete ambivalence and lack of any sort of outrage for the genocide in Gaza over the last 2.5 years. So it's an extension of that. Gaza set the precedent, and now they've transferred this same tactic of all-out war against the people of Iran. Because there's no expectation of regime change even now, Nima. And as we mentioned when we were talking offline before this broadcast, that's why the United States is, perhaps we can talk about this later, but are now sort of attempting to pull the proxy card by backing Iranian Kurdish militants that are currently gathering in Iraqi Kurdistan to be deployed over the border to sow mayhem and chaos into Iran. I mean, that's just an act of desperation by the United States, because they seem to, they wouldn't be doing that if everything they said and promised and told the public over the last couple of weeks was actually true or remotely possible. Of course, it wasn't. And now they're defaulting to the proxy war, pulling the proxy card with another sort of, duping the Kurds, or a different group of Kurds have been being duped again by the United States. How many times do the Kurds have to be duped? In Syria, in Iraq, and now they're doing it again with Iran. So this is clearly a cynical move by the U.S. and U.S. Special Forces and British Special Forces will be embedded with them. They're training them right now, and they'll be deployed inside. All of those groups will be deployed inside Iran, and we know what happens after that, Nima, which is that it's pretty certain that the PMUs in Iraq, the Shiite PMUs, will be invited to join that fight inside Iran. I have no doubt. And then that brings up the prospect of a civil war in Iraq. And the Iraqi Kurds they're trying to maintain this position of neutrality. The Barzani-led KRG, they're trying to maintain this position of neutrality, but I don't see how they can be neutral anymore, pretend to be neutral, because they're hosting U.S. operations, overt and covert. They're hosting Israeli intelligence, and they're using it as a lily pad to jump and attack Iran. And now everybody knows. What's interesting about this story, Nima, is that CNN was leaking this and doing it in a context of criticizing, saying that this could be complicated for Trump. Now, I was shocked when I saw this coming out of someone like Natasha Bertrand and Clarissa Ward pushing this out. I mean, really across social media, even using their own personal accounts. And I've always regarded Clarissa Ward as a CIA type of media asset, a propagandist, as well as Natasha Bertrand. But we're seeing this interest. There's a little bit of a split across the U.S. mainstream media on this. Now, that could be a partisan thing, or it could be the fact that there is a genuine rebellion against the monolithic narrative that we normally have in the U.S. during a war. This is kind of unprecedented, is that we don't have that monolithic narrative seems to be somewhat fractured here. And there could be a split in the CIA, for all I know, or some rebellious activity going on. I can't see how that story and how that they portrayed it when they leaked it to be designed, it seems, to damage Trump, but also signaling to the Iranians that this is coming. I mean, maybe there's something more sophisticated, another 5D chess move being played here by the CIA, but I found that to be, I've not seen that before. Let's just put it that way. Not in 20, 25 years. So that's just another unusual subplot here that's unfolding.
Yeah. Yesterday we had Pete Hegseth coming out and saying, bragging about that we are winning and the victory is, is happening as we talk. And if they're winning, why do they need to beg these Kurdish terrorists to do that, to bribe them into some sort of terrorist attack on Iran? On the other hand, the other signs that are not so much promising for the United States are, we had France, Italy, Spain, even Spain, and together with the United Kingdom joining, helping the United States defending, bringing all these forces. We can say, literally, we can say NATO is helping the United States. And they are all together to defend. It doesn't seem that their defense system is working. That's why they need all these countries coming together in order to defend Israel.
Well, the other problem they have is the U.S. started the war, so even if Iran indeed attacked, there's questions as to what hit RAF Akratory in Cyprus. Actually, this to me is somewhat of an open question. I'm researching that at the moment, but U.S. is the lead partner in NATO. They started the war, so Article 5 is null and void. There's no like all for one for all on this regarding NATO. Certainly not with Turkey. So that's NATO is effectively sidelined as any sort of a shaped organization that's going to drive this conflict. That's the first thing. But politically, we do have that sort of lockstep, if you will, that rapid response mechanism that's run normally through the G7 countries, where they streamline all their statements during a national security crisis. That's kind of like what we're seeing here. And that's bloc politics, Nima. That's bloc power politics. That's World War I nation state behavior. That's the danger of bloc power politics and bloc politics, and having rapid response mechanism mandates between G7 countries that they all have to have exactly the same. That is signed. That is agreed by all G7 countries. They will have exactly the same statements during a national security crisis. So that means that any individual government can't have an independent foreign policy or a viewpoint on any situation. They must all pile in and support Israel and the United States on this. So so in terms of vassalized European countries, that's where it's at right now. This would have been the ultimate test if any European country or any NATO member had any independent foreign policy. I mean, the normal outliers within NATO would be, for instance, with Ukraine, is Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic to some degree emerging as a skeptic on the and not participating in the Ukraine war. But namely, we're talking about Slovakia and Hungary. Hungary is probably the most pro-Israeli government in Europe, arguably anyway, Zionist government. So they're not going to oppose this kind of European lockstep position on this. But the most important are the so-called E3. They're trying to drag Greece into this. That's actually something that's somewhat dangerous, considering the relationship and the tension between Greece and Turkey. And if they want to inflame the Cyprus situation, the U.S. or Israel could very easily inflame the Cyprus situation, which would compel Turkey to intervene in Cyprus to secure its borders and its interests in Cyprus. And certainly, I would not put it past the Israelis to light that match at some point. That's a risk. That's always going to be a risk. But the other thing is, if Iran decides to unload missiles on U.S. and British bases in Cyprus, there's really nothing any of the European countries can do. I don't think they don't really have the capability to attack Iran, and they're just asking for more reprisals. And when we strip this all down, the U.S. started this war. The U.S. and Israel fully started this war. They're totally ready. They prepared for it. They were always planning to wage this war. So really, I think the European countries don't have any leg to stand on morally or legally especially if this careens into a wider world war, they only have themselves to blame for not standing up and using this moment to at least separate themselves from the United States. And the U.S. has been a rogue state. Look at what they did in Venezuela in late 2025. I mean, that's just a complete abrogation of international norms, and then stealing the oil, openly bragging about hijacking tankers and seizing the oil and selling it for cash and keeping the money. I mean, that's just piracy, open piracy. So this is really a breakdown of the international system right now that I think is equivalent to the breakdown of the international system in 1938. And while the West likes to fetishize and wag their finger and accuse everybody of being Hitler and accuse every single flashpoint as being the Sudetenland, the reality is that if you want to transpose a 1938 narrative on this situation, the United States is Nazi Germany and Israel is Nazi Germany in 2026. So if you want to do that comparison, that analogy, then it's pretty clear who Germany is. And Germany is historically recognized as undermining and ultimately destroying the concept of the League of Nations, and was the impetus for the creation of the United Nations and all of the international framework that came post World War II. So the United States is the violator. They're the instigator. They're the aggressor, and Israel is their sort of partner in this. So those are the threats to world peace. It's the United States and Israel. There's no doubt. There should be no doubt in anyone's mind. It's not Russia. It's not China. It's not Iran. It is the United States and Israel is now threatening global stability. They're threatening the global economy. And we're not far from one of those two countries threatening to or openly touting to use nuclear weapons if they don't get their way, or if they're backed into such a corner that they need to save face and stave off a loss, a relative loss anyway, in this military venture which they themselves have started. So that is very comparable to World War II. But obviously the masks have flipped. It's not the Allies and the Axis powers have flipped on this occasion.